Captain Vincent Hayes stood in the command center of his ship, staring at the reports that made his blood run cold. For 3 weeks now, children had been vanishing from human colonies along the outer rim, not just one or two, but dozens of them. The security footage showed the same thing every time. Large armored creatures appeared in the night, moved through the settlements with surprising stealth, and left with human children clutched carefully in their claws. The creatures were Kralnoth, and everyone in the galaxy knew what that meant. They were hunters, killers, predators that stood 3 meters tall with shells like tanks and blades growing from their arms. They had fought wars across a dozen star systems and never once showed mercy to anyone. Now they were taking human children, and Vincent could only imagine the worst. Sophie Martinez, his second officer, brought him another data pad filled with more bad news. The colonies were panicking. Parents were arming themselves. Some settlements were talking about launching their own rescue missions, which would only get more people killed. The military wanted to send in strike teams, blast the Kralnoth nest to rubble, and sort out the survivors later. Vincent couldn't allow that. Those were children out there, human children who might still be alive. He needed to know what was really happening before anyone started a war that could spread across the galaxy. He assembled his best people for a reconnaissance mission. They would find the Kralnoth home nest, observe what was happening, and then decide on the best course of action. Commander Jake Sullivan led the ground team. He was a good soldier, level-headed and careful, exactly the kind of person Vincent needed for something this delicate. Jake handpicked his squad from volunteers who had families of their own, people who understood what was at stake. They spent 2 weeks tracking Kralnoth ships through deep space, following the trails back to their source. The Kralnoth homeworld was a harsh place, all red rocks and deep caverns. The nests were underground, massive tunnel systems that went down for kilometers. Jake and his team landed their shuttle far from the main entrance and approached on foot. They wore light armor and carried weapons, but Jake had given strict orders. Nobody fires unless fired upon. They were here to gather information, not to start a massacre. Dr. Patricia Cole was with them, a xenobiologist who had studied alien species for 20 years. She was nervous but determined. If anyone could understand what the Kralnoth were doing with the children, it would be her. As they crept through the outer tunnels, they could hear sounds echoing from deeper in the nest. Strange sounds that didn't match what they expected. The sounds were laughter. Jake held up his fist and the team froze. He activated his scanner, checking for Kralnoth warriors, and found dozens of them ahead. But mixed in with their heat signatures were smaller ones, human-sized. The children were there and they were moving around freely. Jake signaled his team forward, moving carefully around a corner into a massive central chamber. What they saw made no sense at all. Human children were everywhere, and none of them were in cages. A small boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, was riding on the back of a Kralnoth warrior like it was a game. The warrior was making clicking sounds and the boy was laughing. Teenage kids sat in groups with younger Kralnoth, showing them things on datapads. A little girl was braiding something that looked like fiber cords while 3 Kralnoth watched with what could only be described as fascination. Jake lowered his weapon slowly. His team did the same, all of them staring in disbelief. Patricia stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overriding her caution. That's when the Kralnoth noticed them. Warriors moved to surround them, but they didn't attack. Instead, an old Kralnoth, larger than the others with scars covering her shell, came forward. She made a series of clicks and growls, and Patricia's translator device started working. "You are the ones who have come for the young humans," the old Kralnoth said. Her voice came through the translator as female, old and tired. "We knew you would come eventually. But before you take them away, you should understand what has happened here. You should see what they have taught us." Jake looked at Patricia, then back at the Kralnoth elder. "What do you mean, taught you? You took these children from their homes. Their families think they're dead or worse." The elder Kralnoth made a sound that the translator interpreted as sadness. "We did not explain well. We were afraid you would not understand. But the young ones were not taken as prey or slaves. They came to teach us something we had forgotten. Something we never knew we needed to learn." She gestured with one of her blade arms toward a group of children sitting with Kralnoth younglings. They were sharing food, talking, playing some kind of game with colored stones. "Come sit, watch, learn what we have learned. Then you can decide what happens next." Jake wanted to grab the children and run. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap, that the Kralnoth were playing some kind of game. But the children looked healthy. More than that, they looked happy. And the way they interacted with the Kralnoth, there was no fear in them at all. Against his better judgment, Jake ordered his team to lower their weapons, but stay alert. Patricia moved closer to the elder, her mind already racing with questions. How had this happened? Why had the Kralnoth taken the children? What did she mean about teaching them? Over the next several hours, they heard a story that would change everything humanity thought it knew about survival in the galaxy. It was a story that began 6 months ago with one 12-year-old girl and a choice that should have gotten her killed. It was a story about what happens when you place humanity's most vulnerable members in front of the galaxy's most dangerous predators. It was a story that started with kindness and ended with a revolution that nobody saw coming. And as Jake listened, watching human children play freely among creatures that could tear them apart without effort, he began to understand something profound. Humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their technology or their military might. It was something much simpler and infinitely more powerful. It was their children. The Kralnoth elder, who introduced herself as Kalshara, led Jake and his team deeper into the nest. Patricia walked beside her, recording everything with her equipment while trying to process what she was seeing. The tunnels were decorated with drawings, crude but recognizable pictures made by human children. Stars, planets, families, and strange hybrid images of humans and Kralnoth together. They entered a smaller chamber where an older human girl sat with several Kralnoth warriors. She was maybe 12 or 13 with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. When she saw Jake and his team, she smiled with relief but didn't look scared or desperate to leave. That alone told Jake something unusual was happening here. "Amy," Kalshara said, gesturing to the girl, "tell them your story. Tell them how this began." Amy Peterson stood up and walked over to Jake. She looked tired but healthy, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "I know everyone must be worried. I'm sorry about that. But please listen to what happened before you judge them. 6 months ago," Amy explained, she had been exploring the woods near her family's farm on the colony world of New Terra. She liked to hike alone, much to her parents' frustration, and that day she had gone further than usual. That's when she heard the crash. A Kralnoth scout ship had malfunctioned and gone down in the forest. 3 warriors survived, but they were injured, their shells cracked and leaking the fluid that served as their blood. They had sent a distress signal but knew it would take days for their people to arrive. On a human world, surrounded by potential enemies, they prepared to die fighting. Then a human child found them. Amy had stumbled onto their crash site and seen them trying to patch their wounds with emergency foam that wasn't working properly. Any reasonable person would have run. Any smart person would have called for security forces. Amy did neither of those things. They looked hurt, Amy said simply, as if that explained everything. "I had a first aid kit in my backpack. My mom always makes me carry one. So I helped them." Jake stared at her. "You helped them?" "Amy, these are Kralnoth. They're predators. They could have killed you." "They could have," Amy agreed. "But they didn't. They just looked confused. One of them, his name is Torgon, he tried to wave me away. He didn't want me to get close. But I could see the wound on his side was bad. So I used the antiseptic spray and the bandages. It took me 2 hours to help all 3 of them." Kalshara made a sound like a sigh. "For 600 cycles, my people have traveled the stars. We have met 73 species. Every single one of them, when they found injured Kralnoth, they either ran in fear or attacked to finish us. Never once did anyone help. Never once did anyone show kindness." Patricia was recording everything, her hands shaking slightly as she held her equipment.
"What happened after Amy helped them?"
Amy explained that she had returned the next day with more supplies. And the day after that, the Kralnoth warriors had been shocked into silence. They couldn't understand why this small human, this child who they could have easily killed, kept coming back to help them. When their rescue ship finally arrived, they had insisted on taking Amy with them, not as a prisoner but as a guest. "I left my parents a note," Amy said quickly. "I told them I was safe and that I'd explain everything later. I know that was stupid and they must have been terrified. But the Kralnoth wanted me to meet their leaders. They wanted to understand how humans could raise a child who would help their enemies. That visit had led to more questions. The Kralnoth had spent decades fighting other species, always assuming that violence was the natural state of the universe. But here was a human child who chose compassion over fear. They wanted to know if Amy was unique or if other human children were like her. So they asked if more children could visit. Amy said, "Not as prisoners or hostages." As teachers, they wanted to learn how humans think, how we're raised, what makes us different. I helped send messages to other colonies. Some parents said yes. They understood what this could mean. Jake felt his anger rising. Those parents let their children come here? To a Kralnoth nest? My mom was one of them, a voice said from behind them. A boy about 8 years old stepped forward, followed by a Kralnoth warrior who moved protectively close to him. I'm Marcus. I've been here for 2 months. My mom said this was important, that it could stop wars. She was right. Patricia knelt down to Marcus's eye level. What have you been doing here, Marcus? The boy's face lit up with excitement. Teaching them about Earth, about farms and gardens and how to clean water. They didn't know any of that stuff. They only knew how to fight and hunt. But I showed them how my dad's farm works, and now they're growing their own food. Look, Marcus led them to another chamber where Kralnoth were tending to rows of plants growing under artificial lights. They moved carefully, their blade arms surprisingly gentle as they checked soil and adjusted watering systems. A few human children supervised, giving advice and encouragement. More children came forward with their own stories. Katie and Brandon, teenage siblings, had taught the Kralnoth about sports and games. The warriors had initially dismissed it as pointless, but then they discovered how these activities built teamwork and communication. Now the Kralnoth had regular training sessions that looked more like soccer practice than military drills. A group of younger children, none older than 6, had simply played with the Kralnoth younglings. They shared toys, made up games, and treated the alien children like any other playmates. The adult Kralnoth had watched in amazement as their own young, who had been raised to be aggressive and territorial, learned to cooperate and share. But the most powerful moment came when a toddler named Danny, barely 3 years old, waddled up to a massive scarred warrior and held up a flower he had grown in the nest's new garden. The warrior, a veteran of countless battles, carefully took the flower in his claw and made a sound that the translator couldn't interpret but everyone recognized as crying. Cal Shara watched this scene with what looked like pride. Your young do not see us as monsters. They see us as people who need help, who need friends, who need to learn a better way. In 6 months, they have taught us more about civilization than we learned in 600 years of conquest. Jake looked around the chamber at the children playing, teaching and laughing with creatures that should terrify them. He thought about the orders waiting back on his ship, the military plans to assault this nest and rescue the hostages. Except they weren't hostages. They were ambassadors, and they were winning a peace that no army could achieve. He tapped his communicator. Sullivan to Horizon's Edge. Cancel the assault plans. We have a situation here, but it's not what we thought. Repeat, stand down all military operations. You're not going to believe what I'm about to report. Dr. Patricia Cole spent the next week living in the Kralnoth nest, documenting everything she observed. What she discovered changed her entire understanding of human evolution and survival. The children weren't just teaching the Kralnoth about farming or games. They were teaching them how to be a society instead of just an army. She watched 10-year-old Marcus explain water filtration to a group of confused warriors. He used simple words and drew pictures in the dirt, breaking down complex ideas into steps a child could understand. The Kralnoth, who had conquered worlds with advanced weapons, had never thought about clean water as anything other than something you took from your enemies. Now they were building their own purification systems, excited about the idea of not depending on raids for resources. Katie and Brandon, the teenage siblings, had accidentally revolutionized Kralnoth culture in a different way. They had introduced the concept of teams competing for fun rather than survival. At first, the warriors couldn't grasp why anyone would fight without the goal of killing the opponent. But after Katie explained the rules of basketball and Brandon organized the first game, something clicked. The Kralnoth discovered that working together toward a common goal felt better than fighting each other for dominance. Their military training had always been individual warriors proving their strength. Now they practiced formations and strategies that relied on every member of the team. Combat effectiveness actually improved, but more importantly, the warriors started to trust each other in ways they never had before. Lieutenant Greg Foster, part of Jake's team, sat with Patricia as they watched a game between mixed teams of humans and Kralnoth. This doesn't make sense, Greg said. These are apex predators. They should have eaten the kids the moment they arrived. Patricia shook her head, her eyes never leaving her data pad as she took notes. That's what I thought too, but I've been analyzing their behavior, comparing it to Earth predators. The Kralnoth are hunters, yes, but they're also social. They live in groups, raise their young collectively, and have complex communication. They're more like wolves than sharks. Wolves still eat things, Greg pointed out. True, but wolves can also be domesticated. They can bond with humans, protect them, work with them. The Kralnoth have the same capacity for social bonding. They just never had a reason to use it with other species before. Patricia gestured to where little Danny was showing a Kralnoth youngling how to stack blocks. And then human children arrived and treated them like friends instead of monsters. The real breakthrough had come from the youngest children, the ones too young to understand fear or prejudice. Toddlers like Danny didn't care that the Kralnoth had blades for arms or shells like armor. They just saw big creatures who would play with them, protect them, and help them reach things on high shelves. Patricia interviewed Amy again, trying to understand the psychology behind her initial decision to help the crashed warriors. "Weren't you scared at all?" she asked. Amy thought about it carefully. "I was nervous, maybe. But my parents always taught me that being scared of something doesn't mean you should be cruel to it. Those warriors were hurt and alone on a strange world. I've been hurt before. I know what it feels like to need help. I couldn't just leave them there." That simple empathy, that ability to see suffering and respond with kindness regardless of who was suffering, turned out to be humanity's secret weapon. The Kralnoth had expected humans to be like every other species they'd met, driven by fear and self-interest. Instead, they found a species whose children were programmed to build bridges before they even understood what walls were. Kalshara explained it to Patricia during a long conversation in her private chamber. "We raised our young to be strong, to dominate, to take what they needed by force. It made us powerful, but it also made us alone. Every species we met became either prey or enemy. There was no third option in our understanding, and now?" Patricia asked. "Now we see that strength without connection is just isolation. Your children showed us this. They are physically weak, yes. Any of our warriors could harm them easily. But they came into our nest without weapons, without fear, and they changed us more profoundly than any army ever could." The elder Kralnoth pulled up a holographic display showing data about their species' history. Wars, conquests, territories gained and lost. Centuries of conflict with nothing to show for it but scars and enemies. "We thought this was strength. We thought this was how powerful species survived. But we were not surviving. We were barely existing, always fighting, always losing warriors, always making new enemies." She changed the display to show the last 6 months. Kralnoth learning agriculture, warriors playing sports, adults and children of both species working together on projects. "This is what your young brought us. Not weakness disguised as peace, but actual strength through cooperation. We are learning to build instead of just taking. We are learning to create instead of just destroying." Patricia watched as Marcus taught a group of Kralnoth how to build a simple generator using spare parts. The boy was patient, encouraging, and excited to share his knowledge. The warriors listened with an attention they probably never gave their own military instructors. "He's 12, Patricia said softly. "He should be playing video games and complaining about homework. Instead, he's teaching aliens how to generate electricity." "Is this normal for human children?" Kalshara asked. "This desire to teach, to help, to befriend?" Patricia nodded slowly. "More normal than most humans realize. We spend so much time teaching our kids to be careful, to not talk to strangers, to protect themselves. But their first instinct before we train it out of them is to trust and to connect. We call it innocence, and we usually think of it as something they need to lose to survive. Maybe we've been wrong about that." She thought about Earth's history, about how humans had domesticated wolves and horses and dozens of other species, how they had formed alliances and trade networks spanning continents, how they had survived not by being the strongest or fastest, but by being the best at making friends out of potential enemies. "Our children aren't innocent," Patricia said finally. "They're just not corrupted yet by fear and prejudice. They see the world as it could be instead of how it is, and apparently when you give them the chance, they'll try to make it better." Greg came over with new reports from the other human colonies. More parents were volunteering to let their children visit the Kralnoth. Some families were even talking about relocating permanently to help establish what they were calling an exchange program. The military was less enthusiastic, but they couldn't argue with results. The Kralnoth had stopped all raids on human territory and were asking for diplomatic relations. Jake gathered his team to discuss what came next. They could take the children home, report everything they'd seen, and let the politicians figure it out. or they could stay and help facilitate what was clearly becoming a historic moment in galactic relations. "The kids don't want to leave," Jake said, looking at his notes from interviews with each child. "They feel like they're doing something important. And honestly, they are." Patricia closed her datapad and stood up. "I'm staying. This is the most significant xenosociological event in human history. I can't just walk away from it." One by one, the rest of the team agreed. They would stay, not as soldiers, but as observers and helpers. They would make sure the children stayed safe while also letting them continue the work they'd started. Because somehow, against all logic and expectation, Earth's young had accomplished what no army could. They had turned the galaxy's most feared predators into friends. News of what happened with the Kralnoth spread through the galaxy, faster than anyone expected. Within days, every major species had heard about the human children who walked into a predator nest and came out with allies. The story seemed impossible, like some kind of propaganda or fiction. But the evidence was undeniable. The Kralnoth, who had been at war with half the galaxy, had stopped fighting and started talking. The Galactic Council called an emergency session. Representatives from 200 species gathered on the neutral station orbiting the Council world. Ambassador Claire Bennett stood at the center of it all, trying to explain something she barely understood herself. "Let me be clear," said the Vexitari representative, a being made of crystalline structures that glowed with internal light. "Your species sent children, your most vulnerable members, to live with the Kralnoth. And you did this intentionally?" Claire chose her words carefully. "The children volunteered. Their parents gave permission. We didn't fully understand what would happen, but the initial contact suggested it might be beneficial." "Beneficial?" The Thorian delegate, a massive creature covered in thick fur, made a sound like grinding rocks. "The Kralnoth have killed thousands of our people over the last century. And you send them children as what, a peace offering?" "Not as an offering," Claire corrected. "As teachers, as friends, as a chance for both species to see each other differently." The council chamber erupted in debate. Some species were outraged, calling it reckless endangerment. Others were curious, wanting to know more about how such a strategy could work. A few, the ones who had fought the Kralnoth and lost, were simply relieved that the wars might be ending. Back on the horizon's edge, Captain Vincent Hayes watched the council proceedings on his view screen. Sophie Martinez sat beside him, reviewing requests that were flooding in from across the galaxy. "Sir, we're getting messages from 17 different species. They want to establish similar programs with their own populations." Vincent raised his eyebrows. "They want human children to visit them?" "That's what they're calling it. The Human Juvenile Integration Program. They've seen what happened with the Kralnoth and they want the same thing for their people." Sophie pulled up one of the requests. "The Chixtal are asking for help with their hive communication systems. They think human children might have insights their own scientists are missing." It sounded absurd, but Vincent had seen the impossible become reality once already. He approved a small pilot program, sending carefully selected families to 3 different species for short visits. They would monitor everything closely and pull people out at the first sign of trouble. The first results came back within a month, and they were remarkable. Young Olivia Turner, age 9, had spent 3 weeks with the insectoid Chixtal. Their society operated like a massive hive, with every individual connected through complex pheromone signals. They had been struggling with information overload, too many signals crossing and creating confusion. Olivia had watched them for a few days, then suggested they try using what she called relay stations like the game telephone she played at school. The Chixtal scientists had been skeptical, but they tried it. By creating designated individuals who filtered and directed information, rather than broadcasting everything to everyone, they reduced communication errors by 40%. The solution was so simple that the Chixtal couldn't believe they hadn't thought of it themselves. But as their lead scientist explained to Vincent, they were so deep in their own complex systems that they couldn't see the simple answer. "The human child looked at our problem with fresh eyes," the scientist said through the translator. "No preconceptions, no assumptions about how things should work. Just observation and a simple suggestion. It changed everything." Brothers Alex and Chris, teenagers who loved swimming, had visited the aquatic Naldori. These beings lived underwater and had never developed competitive sports because their entire culture focused on survival, swimming, and hunting. The brothers introduced them to swimming races, diving competitions, and synchronized swimming just for fun. The Naldori were transformed by the concept. For the first time, they saw their natural abilities as something to celebrate rather than just use for survival. Within weeks, they had developed an entire athletic culture around aquatic activities, but more importantly, it changed how they viewed their young. Instead of pushing children into hunting roles as soon as they could swim, they let them play and develop naturally. Stress levels dropped across their entire society. Dr. Henry Chang, a xenopsychologist, published a paper analyzing what was happening. It quickly became the most downloaded document in galactic history. His conclusion was simple but profound. Human children succeeded where adults failed because they hadn't learned to see differences as threats. They approached every new being with curiosity instead of fear, with friendship instead of suspicion. Adult humans have learned caution, Henry wrote. They assess danger, calculate risk, and protect themselves. This is smart and necessary for survival. But human children operate on a different principle. They assume good intent until proven otherwise. They offer trust before it's earned. And somehow this approach triggers reciprocal behavior in other species. When you treat someone like a friend, they often become one. The military establishment was less impressed. General Carl Peterson, head of Earth Defense Forces, confronted Ambassador Claire at a private meeting. "This is insanity, Claire. We're sending children to potentially hostile aliens based on what? The hope that they'll be nice to kids?" Claire understood his concern. "We're not sending them randomly, Carl. We screen the host species carefully. We maintain constant monitoring, and we only send families who volunteer with full knowledge of the risks. But why risk them at all? We have diplomats, trained negotiators, people who understand alien psychology. And those trained diplomats have been trying for decades to make the progress that kids made in weeks. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe training and caution and careful calculation aren't always the answer. Maybe sometimes you need someone who doesn't know enough to be afraid." Carl wasn't convinced, but he couldn't argue with the results. Species that had been neutral or even hostile to humanity were now requesting cultural exchanges. Trade agreements were being signed. Research partnerships were forming, and all of it traced back to children who treated aliens like potential friends. The most significant change came from an unexpected source. The Zarathian Empire, the largest and most militaristic power in the known galaxy, had been watching everything with their usual cold analysis. They didn't believe in friendship between species. They believed in strength, dominance, and clear hierarchies. The idea that children could achieve diplomatic breakthroughs seemed like weakness to them. But their emperor, Zaldor, was a practical ruler. He decided to test this human phenomenon under controlled conditions. He sent an invitation for a single human family to visit the Zarathian homeworld as guests of the imperial court. The family would be watched constantly, studied, and assessed. If this human trait was real, the Zarathians wanted to understand it. If it was a trick or weakness, they wanted to exploit it. Vincent personally selected the Henderson family for this mission. Nick and Laura Henderson were teachers, calm and thoughtful people who understood cross-cultural communication. Their children were Tyler, age 14, Megan, age 10, and Zoe, age 4. Commander Jake Sullivan was assigned as their security escort, though everyone knew his real job was to observe and report. The Hendersons arrived on the Zarathian homeworld with no idea that they were about to trigger the biggest shift in galactic politics in 1,000 years. They were just a family who thought it would be interesting to meet aliens and teach their kids about other cultures. Little Zoe Henderson was about to prove that sometimes the smallest people can move the largest empires. The Zarathian Imperial Palace was built from black stone and sharp angles, designed to intimidate anyone who entered. Emperor Zaldor sat on his throne in the Great Hall, surrounded by his elite guard, watching as the human family was brought before him. He had conquered 40 star systems through military might and ruthless strategy. He did not believe that children could change anything that mattered. Nick and Laura Henderson stood with their children, trying to appear calm even though they were terrified. Tyler, the oldest, stayed close to his parents, his teenage bravado failing him in the face of the towering armored warriors surrounding them. Megan held her little sister's hand tightly, but Zoe, only 4 years old, didn't seem scared at all. She was looking around the great hall with wide eyes, taking in everything with a child's fascination. The guards, each one over 2 meters tall and carrying weapons that could level buildings, might as well have been interesting statues to her. When Emperor Zaldor began speaking, his words translated into English by devices everyone wore. Zoe's attention shifted to him with complete focus. "You are the humans," Zaldor said, his voice deep and commanding. "You believe your young can change the nature of the galaxy through simple kindness. I find this claim doubtful. You will stay here as my guests. My scientists will study you. We will determine if there is truth to these reports or if it is merely propaganda." Nick started to respond, but Zoe let go of Megan's hand and walked forward. Laura reached for her daughter, but Jake, standing nearby, shook his head slightly. "Let this play out," his expression said. Laura's heart hammered in her chest as her 4-year-old approached the emperor of the most powerful military force in the galaxy. Zoe stopped a few meters from the throne and looked up at Zaldor. Then she reached into her small backpack and pulled out a package of cookies that Laura had packed for the journey. "You look sad," Zoe said in her clear child's voice. "Do you want a cookie?" "Cookies make me feel better when I'm sad." The entire hall went silent. The guards tensed, their hands moving toward their weapons. Nobody spoke to the emperor like that. Nobody suggested he was sad. And nobody ever approached him without permission. Zaldor stared at the tiny human child holding out a cookie to him. In his 200 years of life, he had been feared, respected, hated, and obeyed. He had never been offered comfort. He had never had anyone, especially a child, look at him with concern instead of terror. Something in the emperor's chest tightened. He stood slowly from his throne, his movements careful, and descended the steps until he was level with Zoe. He knelt down, bringing his face closer to hers, and for the first time in decades, he removed his ceremonial mask. Tears were running down his scaled face. "I am sad," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "I have been sad for many years, but I thought strength meant hiding that sadness. I thought rulers could not show weakness." Zoe nodded seriously, like this made perfect sense to her. "My daddy says it's okay to cry. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you honest." She held the cookie out again. "Please take it. It's chocolate chip." "They're really good." Zaldor took the cookie with a trembling hand. His elite guard, hardened warriors who had never seen their emperor show emotion, watched in shock as he ate the cookie and smiled. "It is good," he said. "Thank you, little one." Over the next week, something remarkable happened in the Zarathian Empire. Zoe treated everyone she met with the same open friendliness she'd shown the emperor. She asked the guards about their families. She shared her toys with Zarathian children. She complimented their armor and asked if they wanted to play games with her. Tyler and Megan, seeing their little sister's success, relaxed and started interacting naturally with the Zarathians too. Tyler discovered that many of the young warriors loved strategy games, and he introduced them to chess. Megan started teaching music to a group of Zarathian children who had never heard the concept of singing for enjoyment rather than ritual. But it was Zoe who changed everything. The Imperial Guards, who were selected for their absolute loyalty and trained to feel no emotion, found themselves competing for the chance to watch over her. The one she called Krixtal, the most decorated warrior in the guard, became her constant companion. She rode on his shoulders. She brought him flowers from the palace gardens. She asked him to tell her stories about his life. Commander Jake Sullivan filed daily reports back to Earth, each one more astonishing than the last. "I don't understand how it's working," he wrote. "These are the most disciplined military force in the galaxy. They've been trained since childhood to value strength above all else, but a 4-year-old human is making them question everything they believe." Dr. Patricia Cole, who had traveled to the Zarathian homeworld to observe, finally understood what was happening. She sent her own report to the scientific community. "Human children don't just offer friendship," she wrote. "They offer unconditional positive regard. They see the best in everyone they meet, and they reflect that back. When a child looks at a warrior and sees someone worthy of cookies and comfort, that warrior has to confront the person they could be versus the person they've been trained to be. And apparently, across every species we've encountered, the response to genuine compassion is the same. It breaks down walls we didn't even know we had built." The turning point came during a formal dinner 3 weeks into the visit. Emperor Zaldor had invited his top military commanders to meet the human family. These were hard beings, responsible for conquering worlds and crushing rebellions. They sat around the table in full armor, expecting to intimidate the humans into showing proper deference. Instead, Zoe climbed onto Krixtal's lap and started braiding the decorative cords on his armor. while she told him about her favorite cartoon. Tyler challenged a group of commanders to a chess tournament. Megan taught them a song her school choir had performed. Nick and Laura, taking their cue from their children, treated the assembled warriors like dinner guests rather than potential threats. One of the oldest commanders, a veteran named Shartek who had led armies for 50 years, put down his utensils and spoke directly to Emperor Zaldor. "My lord, I have a confession. When you announced this human visit, I thought it was a waste of time. I thought we would study them, find their weakness, and use it against them if they ever became a threat. And now," Zaldor asked, "now I believe we have been the weak ones. We built an empire on fear and force. We thought that made us strong. But these humans, these children, they have shown me something I forgot long ago. They have shown me joy, purpose beyond conquest, connection beyond hierarchy." He looked at Zoe, who smiled at him while continuing her braiding. "That small child has more courage than most of my soldiers. She walked into this palace, faced me and you and all of us, and she didn't try to prove she was strong. She just tried to be kind, and somehow that kindness is stronger than all our weapons." Emperor Zaldor stood up, and everyone at the table immediately fell silent. This was the moment when he would pronounce judgment on the human experiment. The galaxy was watching, waiting to see if the most powerful military force would reject this new approach or embrace it. "For 600 years, Zaldor said slowly, the Zerathian Empire has expanded through military might. We have been successful by every measurable standard. We control resources, territory, and populations. But I ask you, my commanders, are we happy? Are our people content? Do our children laugh and play? Or do they train for war from the moment they can walk?" Nobody answered. They knew the truth. The humans sent us their children not as diplomats or soldiers, but simply as children, and in doing so, they have revealed what we lost somewhere in our centuries of conquest. We forgot how to be people instead of weapons. He looked at Nick and Laura. "You raised these young ones to see the good in everyone, to offer help before seeking advantage, to treat strangers as potential friends. How did you do this?" Laura spoke for the first time, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "We didn't do anything special, Your Majesty. We just loved them, protected them, and taught them that other people's feelings matter. The rest came naturally to them. Children are born wanting to connect. We just tried not to teach them to stop." Zaldor made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. "Then we have much to learn from you. I am announcing the end of Zerathian expansion through military force. Instead, we will seek connection with other species through cultural exchange, and we will start by changing how we raise our own young. No more training them as warriors from birth. Let them be children first. Let them learn to play, to laugh, to offer cookies to sad emperors." The announcement spread across the galaxy within hours. The Zerathian Empire, the greatest military power known to exist, was choosing peace. Not because they were defeated or weak, but because human children had shown them a different path. Back on Earth, in the Global Unity headquarters, Ambassador Claire Bennett met with Secretary General George Patterson. They watched footage of little Zoe teaching Zerathian warriors how to play hopscotch in the palace courtyard. "We've received 400 new requests for cultural exchanges," George said, still trying to process the numbers. "Every major species wants what they're calling the human experience. They want to learn how we raise children who can do this,